Part of the scherzo of Bruckner's Ninth Symphony, the Budapest Festival Orchestra, was conducted by Ivan Fischer on that Channel Classics recording, and the Budapest Festival Orchestra was voted Gramophone's Orchestra of the Year in 2022. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone podcast, the first of two focusing on the 2023 Gramophone Orchestra of the Year award, the only award voted on by gramophone readers and music lovers from around the world. The editors of Gramophone have selected 10 ensembles that have struck us for the remarkable partnership between their principal conductor and the orchestra, as exemplified particularly by their work on record. I've split these 10 orchestras into two groups, and each of these podcasts will focus on 5 ensembles. For this first one, I'm joined by Andrew Mellor, a regular Gramophone contributor based in Denmark. Andrew's recent book, The Northern Silence, Journeys in Nordic Music and Culture, draws on his knowledge and love of things Scandinavian, so among his 5 ensembles I've ensured that a couple come from his neck of the woods. I thought we'd start in your hometown of Copenhagen with the Danish National Symphony Orchestra. This isn't the only band in town, is it? Because you've also got the Copenhagen Philharmonic.
Yeah, the Copenhagen Phil and the Royal Danish Orchestra, of course, which is the sort of the historic orchestra, the one that Carl Nielsen played in. Yeah, but this is the Danish National Symphony Orchestra. Of course, it's the radio orchestra, although unlike the Finnish and Swedish, it doesn't have that in the title. And I think one of the oldest radio orchestras around, established 1925. So yeah, an ensemble with really long, deep history.
It seems to me, I'm judging from sort of reading reviews and listening to the new recordings from Fabio Luisi, that it's actually in very good hands at the moment.
Yeah, it is. And I moved to Copenhagen in 2015, which was around about the time Luisi started as chief conductor. His tenure was actually brought forward by a year. So he started, I think, officially in the summer of 2016. And it's been very much a kind of technical reinvention. You know, he's one of those conductors who arrives at an orchestra and takes it completely to pieces and puts it together again. So there's been a lot of work on technique, articulation, discipline. Some might say micromanagement, but of course, you know, that pays dividends. And anyone who's heard that new Nielsen cycle will hear exactly how. I think it's also worth saying that, you know, this is an orchestra with a really long recording history, with Chandos and with Decca as well. There was last year, I think, or the year before, a nomination in the opera category of the Gramophone Awards for Il Prigioniero, conducted by Gian-Andrea Nozeda. And Nozeda, in a parallel universe, could have been chief conductor of this orchestra, but it just so happened that Luisi was appointed. A very, very long recording history. I remember a Lulu, Albenberg Lulu on Chandos, maybe a decade or two ago, which was highly acclaimed at the time. Yeah, it's really interesting right now because the programming is programmed by Tatiana Kandel, the head of programming here at the Danish radio, is outstanding. There's a sort of one of those orchestras where you open the season brochure, you know, every concert you circle with your red pen because you want to go to it. Unfortunately, you know, there's not enough time.
I mean, that's always the great thing about radio orchestras, is that they can be a little bit more experimental because, you know, they do have that sort of slight luxury that they don't have to rely entirely on bums on seats. You know, there is a bit of leeway. And I think, you know, as we talk about other radio orchestras here, you know, that will be illustrated as well. And so, I mean, Luisi, he always strikes me as a conductor who, you know, adapts really well to where he is. You know, and the fact that, you know, an Italian should take on Nielsen is quite a feather in his cap and do it so well.
Yeah, and he's got a very distinct programming profile for each of his 3 orchestras, so Dallas, NHK in Tokyo and Copenhagen. And like you say, I mean, he's done very interesting things with 20th century repertoire in a way that completely contrasts to, for example, what the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra has done with 20th century repertoire. So he's unearthed some obscure Viennese music from that time, and we're hearing, after Nielsen now, we're hearing a Scriabin cycle, which will also be recorded on DG. A couple of years ago, we had Act 2 of Die Valkyrie with Lisa Davidson and Stephen Milling, which was fantastic, combined with a Roulangor symphony. That was a very, very memorable concert and a masterstroke in programming, I think. And also, you know, let's not forget, this is the Danish National Symphony Orchestra has become almost the web's favourite orchestra. Millions and millions of people have watched its videos of film music, kind of semi-choreographed concerts that it's done on TV and then put onto YouTube. The Godfather, a Morricone concert. And the numbers are outstanding, actually. Literally millions of people have seen these concerts on YouTube. And I think, I take my hat off to them for the reach that the orchestra has in that regard.
And it gives them a wonderful flexibility. I mean, I think it's interesting that if you look back, not massively far, there's been an awful lot of principal conductors there who one associates almost more with opera than the symphonic repertoire. I mean, someone like Lamberto Gardelli, Ulf Schirmer, Gerd Albrecht, Raphael Frubert de Burgos, and then Fabio Luisi, who, of course, stepped in, for a long period when Levine was ill before he got ousted from the Met. I mean, a lot of people thought, Luisi is going to be the next conductor of the Met. Wasn't. But, he clearly is an operatic animal. Yeah,
he is. I mean, and that, as always, it tells in the symphonic music he conducts. I mean, you're right, of course. He has conducted a lot of opera, as has Nozeda, as has Adam Fischer, another regular guest who did a fantastic Parsifal this time last year with the orchestra. But yeah, I mean, in terms of opera, it's that articulation. I mean, not wanting to sort of stereotype nationalistically, but Luisi's idea of articulation as an Italian, as a man raised in Italian opera houses, that really comes across even actually when I think of an Alpine symphony they did just at the end of the kind of COVID lockdowns when the orchestra was for the first time playing at full strength again, and that was incredibly detailed in its articulation. And some of his concerts, I have to say, are sort of almost better listened to on radio or watched on television than they are in the concert hall, because of this sense of perfection and restraint actually that he has on the podium. Means that you kind of sometimes in the concert hall you just think, well, that could have lifted off a bit more. And the advantage is that when guest conductors come in, at the end of the season we had Alondra Della Parra, the South American conductor, and she, completely the opposite approach to Luisi, but benefits from what he's instilled in the orchestra. So she sort of like lets them fly, whereas there's still a sense when Luisi's around, like the headmaster's in town. I mean, not a bad thing, but it's very interesting to see that dynamic.
Now, when we think of Finland these days, it seems one of their major national export is great conductors. I mean, there was a period, I think you mentioned it in your book on Nordic art, about the BBC. Pretty well every BBC orchestra had a Finnish conductor, either as a principal or a guest or, by some kind of association. And actually, discussing the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra, the tables at last are turned. So instead of Finland exporting all these conductors, they have a Brit. I think their first non-Finnish conductor, actually, Nicholas Collin, who joined the orchestra a couple of years ago in 2021. I mean, they've had, Paavo Berglund, Okko Kamu, Leif Segerstam, Jukka-Pekka Saraste, Sakari Oromo, Hannu Lintu. I mean, that's an incredible lineup of terrific musicians. And I must say, we were talking about programming with the Danish National Symphony Orchestra. I mean, the programming of the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra, and certainly as revealed on record, is quite astounding. They've recorded albums of Sibelius, okay, fair enough, but Grażyna Backiewicz, Thomas Ades, and Lotta Venikovsky. I mean, that's quite an exciting quartet of recordings for a new relationship.
Yeah, it is. And the really interesting thing about this orchestra is that you get that in their subscription concerts. It's quite usual to have a subscription concert with 4 living composers in and no dead composers at all, and the concerts are sold out. This is an orchestra that sells almost every one of its seats for every concert. I mean, like you say about Nicholas Collin, the interesting thing is that this orchestra has embodied the change that's occurred in Finland's musical life over the last 15 years. So if we think of the turning point as the opening of the Musiikitalo, the Helsinki Music Centre, I think in 2011 was it? I mean, before that, the orchestra rehearsed and performed in different places, all of them acoustically lousy. Before that, it was a very Finnish orchestra, not just from the podium, but internally staffed almost entirely by Finns. Now it's an international orchestra, very much an international orchestra. Every section almost has non-Finns in it. The rehearsal language has transformed from Finnish to English. That happened around 5 years ago under Hannu Lintu. And it started, as you say, issuing these recordings at a rate of knots, which are made in the same building that it rehearses and performs in. So it's used to the same acoustic. It has a studio underneath the Musica that replicates the actual acoustic of the concert hall. So it was very much Hannu Lintu's project that this orchestra should become sort of known for the European avant-garde almost more than just Sibelius. So you have this extraordinary list of composers. You mentioned some of them. Bacevich, Ades, Bartok, Berio, Ligeti, Lieberson, Messiaen, Lutoslavsky, Hindemith, Zimmermann, Vasks, Larker. It goes on, and as well as profiling the kind of new generation of Finnish composers. Lindberg we know about, and Sariaho of course, but thinking more about Alvin and Happanen, Venikoski, Sebastian Fagerlund. And it's all there for us to see. Anyone, even in Great Britain, can watch via the Finnish state broadcaster's version of iPlayer, Yle Arena it's called. And it's just been an incredible resource. But of course, these recordings are a treasury. And I think Nicholas Collon, a fantastically talented musician and brilliant conductor, but lucky him, arriving at an orchestra which really, under Hannu Lintu, was playing brilliantly and taking advantage of the fact that for the first time it was playing in an acoustic, which really meant it could hear itself and listen to itself.
Yeah, I must say I've been completely knocked out by the recent Grażyna Bacevich recording, which was an editor's choice in the July issue. I mean, they just play this music as if they've been playing that stuff for years. I mean, there's just complete, they're just inside it totally and clearly believe in it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of notes, aren't there? I mean, in those pieces.
A hell of a lot of notes.
One of them's a double piano concerto, isn't it? And it's just, they kind of, they gobble them up, and they sort of seem to have this relish for this period of rich, slightly off centre, early and mid 20th century repertoire. The same with the Zimmermann recordings that they've made, which are among my favourites. It has this responsiveness, I think, and this precision and this rhythmic vitality that you couldn't have when you were playing in the Finlandia Hall, because there was, even if you played physically with rhythmic vitality, no one would sense it. So there was no point. And so I think that's the big transformation, especially that sense of rhythm, which for so many of those composers is really vital. It's got amazing strength in depth. I think of the principal clarinet, Christopher Sundqvist, a player who could easily have a solo career. But as always in Scandinavia, sometimes it's easier to join an orchestra, and you get a good life. So why not? And but just very, very, very high quality players, fantastic brass. This real sort of discipline to the brass section, never overblown, and colour in the woodwinds and more in the strings actually. So just wonderful to see how that ensemble has grown. And also I talk about Hannu Lintu, but credit to Sakari Oramo, who was his predecessor, and to Nicholas Collon.
We were just talking about the benefits of an orchestra rehearsing and performing, and recording for that matter, in the same venue. And for the last few years, the Orchestre de Paris has been doing just that in the Philharmonie de Paris. And I've become a complete groupie of that hall. I mean, it's actually easier to get to that hall than it probably would be to hop on a train and go up to Liverpool or Manchester. So actually, the Orchestre de Paris is in reach. It's a beautiful acoustic. It's a lovely concert hall. And the arrival of Klaus Mekele there in 2021 it just has re-energised that orchestra. And I think what's amazing when you go to a concert there is the audience clearly have taken him totally to heart. And I do feel actually that's something that audiences the world over. I think it's just because he's young and so obviously incredibly talented that people just sort of warm to him. And I was watching him conduct William Walton's Belshazzar's Feast, with the Orchestre de Paris. And you just thought, for a start, how did that happen? But it was absolutely terrific. This massive, great chorus, the orchestra going for it. I think it's one of the very exciting musical partnerships we've got with us. And I mean, the Orchestre de Paris is an interesting one because it's, a relatively young orchestra founded in 1967. And okay, it was built on the Conservatory Orchestra before that, but it's had an astounding number of music directors of considerable eminence. I mean, obviously Charles Munch started it, died all too soon after the creation of the orchestra, followed by Karajan, Schulte, Barenboim, who I think, was there a long time, very much trained that orchestra up. Spichkov, Dochnani, Eschenbach, Pavel Yervi, another great orchestra trainer who I think, made sure the orchestra was in great shape. Brief spell with Daniel Harding, and then, as I say, Klaus Mekele joined them in 2021. I mean, you obviously know his work from Oslo, but I mean, what do you make of this Mekele Orchestre de Paris partnership?
Well, I think what he's brought to that orchestra is focus. And I mean, I say that as someone who, I saw a lot of the Daniel Harding concerts on TV, a lot of Mahler symphonies from Daniel Harding, and I admire him greatly. And it's a fine orchestra, it plays well for him. But for Klaus, I think there's this sense of real, forensic focus. I mean, what he does is sort of combine that sense of detail with a sort of musical intensity, and I think you hear that to some extent on his recent Stravinsky disc. And yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, James, that you mention the concert hall. I mean, the three orchestras we've talked about so far, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and now Paris, all residing in new concert halls. In the case of Paris and Copenhagen, slightly out of town. And the audience has been completely renewed by this. It's an entirely new audience that goes to see the Danish National Symphony Orchestra in the Jean Nouvel Concert Hall in Copenhagen. And I believe it's an entire new audience that goes to the Jean Nouvel Philharmonic de Paris to see the various orchestras.
It's certainly a lot younger audience than you would get, say, in London for from programming like that. I mean, amazed at the number of people in their 30s that you see at his concerts. I mean, it's a very wide sort of age range at those concerts, and they sell out. I mean, they have sort of waiting lists. You have to put your name down if you can't get a seat, which is absolutely astounding.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, and we can talk about the musical qualities as gramophone writers and critics, but I mean, Klaus is great to watch, isn't he? I mean, he's just
he's a
great conductor to watch. I mean, a bit like we'll mention Vladimir Jurovsky later on, but someone for whom the art of conducting is physical as well as musical and audio. He dresses so well. I'm sure this makes a difference to the Parisians. But I mean, I've read in Gramophone, you've written before about what Barenboim did to the orchestra and how he instilled perhaps the foundations in it that we hear today. I mean, there is maybe some sense of a French sound lingering in there with the winds.
The winds, definitely. Absolutely. I think that comes through very much on the Stravinsky album where, the winds play such an important role. And he takes the opening of The Rite of Spring, dangerously slowly. But actually the flexibility and the sort of vibrancy of the wind playing, those French players. I mean, it could only be a French orchestra, which is wonderful that you can actually identify the nationality of an orchestra once again, because they all sounded the same. But actually, no, I think he does get that this is a French orchestra, and actually it's something to really play with, and he does.
Yes, and especially no accident. I mean, I'm sure he thought about that when making that Stravinsky record as kind of his first Decca recording with the orchestra. That this is music born in Paris, and it would have had that sort of French sound. And Stravinsky probably intended that, right? I mean, he surely, in some of the more kind of pagan woodwind sounds in The Rite of Spring, I'm sure he had that sort of thing in his mind. But also this sort of delicacy and edge that the strings have. And, you hear that in whether it's playing Berlioz and Franck or Dutilleux, Dussapin, those kind of more contemporary composers with which it has an association. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see where Klaus and that orchestra go, especially keeping an eye on that Decca contract.
Our next orchestra is actually a chamber orchestra, although it does expand dramatically when needed. This is the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie of Bremen, German orchestra, founded in 1980 by students. And it's had some interesting people associated with it. But really, it's Paavo Järvi's band. I mean, he's been their sort of artistic leader since 2004. I remember Neema Järvi, his dad, telling me that it was this. He just said, it's a love affair. There's no other way to describe it. And it is. I mean, he goes back and performs with them for periods, then goes off to the Tonhalle. I mean, this is a conductor who, is a guest with the truly great orchestras of the world, but he always goes back to Bremen and just makes amazing music. And the most recent album, Haydn, part of a London Symphonies series, 101, 103, is just a glorious example of how they make music together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we live in an age where we've had a lot of these, Meiningen style sort of large chamber orchestras that could play Brahms recording these days. One thinks of the Swedish Chamber Orchestra, some of the other ensembles that have given us that sort of what we would consider chamber scale Brahms, and before that, of course, gave us this sort of very period mentality Beethoven, but with modern instruments. But for me, there was always something special about, if I come back to the Bremen Brahms cycle under Paavo Järvi, that was just such a bracing sound, and this lean, rhythmically precise style they have, all about detail. And yeah, you mentioned Paavo going away, coming back. A project-based orchestra will always have that sort of freshness. And it seems to me that, even, despite 20 years as chief, and I think another 5 associated with the orchestra, so a quarter of a century, he still seems to draw that freshness from it. But so do others. And of course, it's given us Weinberg, hasn't it, on Deutsche Grammophon, and recently Schubert accompanying Matthias Görner unconducted. And again, all those hallmarks of the Bremen style, the sort of that sort of sprung feel that you get from them in Beethoven, in that kind of the sort of the turn of the 19th century, isn't it? That sort of period of music that they do so well. But I have to say, one of my favourite recordings of them is a really old one from 2007. I always remember Lisa Batiashvili's recording of the Beethoven Concerto, coupled with these wonderful miniatures by Tsinsadze, the Georgian composer. Demonstration that this is an orchestra that can really do kind of that folksy ethnic style as well as its kind of Viennese classics.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we've had another Beethoven violin concerto in this last year with Wilde Frang. Interesting, coupled with the Stravinsky, and actually both those works so well show off the precision and the flair of this orchestra. And having someone like Pekka Kuusisto conducting it just adds to the sort of high octane performance style. And then of course they played Bach with David Frey in the Bach Piano Concerto. So it's an incredibly flexible orchestra, and I love hearing them. I think it's a real breath of fresh air.
Yeah, and I think it's really telling that, I've seen, more than I've seen Bremen play live, I've seen Paavo's Estonian Festival Orchestra, and it's interesting how he handpicks some of his players from Bremen, thinking of Florian Donderer, and
who of course leads both orchestras, doesn't he?
He does, and there's a Matthew Hunt, is it, the clarinetist of Bremen, who plays in the Estonian Festival Orchestra. These are players at the top of their game. The sense of an orchestra of soloists, like the Chamber Orchestra of Europe or the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, that sort of setup. But benefiting from this very German kind of civic pride that there is for them in Bremen, and the fact that that is their base, and yet they are very much a kind of world ensemble.
Now, our last orchestra, British orchestra, this is the London Philharmonic, founded in 1932. It was founded by Thomas Beecham and Malcolm Sargent, really to rival the BBC Symphony Orchestra and the London Symphony Orchestra. It's had, some of the conductors, who've been the chief conductor extraordinary. Bernhard Haitink, George Scholti, Klaus Tenstedt, Welser Möst, Kurt Masur, Vladimir Jurovsky, and now, since 2021, Edward Gardner. Wonderful pedigree, and an orchestra we should always remember is one of the house orchestras at Glyndebourne. So during the summer, it goes and plays opera, and I just think that's such an incredibly enriching experience for any orchestra, any symphony orchestra.
Yes, I completely agree. And if you think about the sound culture of the LPO against perhaps its biggest, comparator, the DLSO, it's really telling. You can hear that the LPO is an opera orchestra. This idea of 4 months a year, in the pit at Glyndebourne, responsiveness, the ability to combine the drama with a tendency to sort of set that in relief by playing things slightly cool, and a real warmth to the sound, and very much an ensemble that's always listening, it seems to me. And I was lucky enough to be on the staff for 4 years, so I heard the orchestra a lot weekly in rehearsal and in concert. This was sort of in the heyday of Vladimir Jurovsky, and that was very interesting. But it's so different now with Edward Gardner in charge. The repertoire profile has really shifted, and we're seeing this wealth of British music, a lot of Michael Tippett, Elgar, who of course Jurovsky famously never went near, and Stravinsky, which of course was one of Jurovsky's specialisms. So yeah, it's definitely an orchestra sort of undergoing some transition, but doing that with flair. And Gardner's big statements since he took over have been very telling, including that a complete performance of A Midsummer Marriage, which was issued on disc and very nearly was my Critics' Choice last year in 2022. But yeah, very good to see a sort of English orchestra cleaving to English repertoire.
We just sort of clipped the tail end of the Jurovsky period because he's finished his Stravinsky series. It's interesting, quite a lot of works that overlap with that Klaus Mekele Decca album, The Rite of Spring and Firebird. I mean, I do think, we were talking a while ago about Jurovsky. I do think he's one of the most underrated great conductor of our time. I mean, I really think he's a magnificent musical force of nature, and his programming is just, a concert a few weeks ago of Ustvolskaya, then the Hindemith Violin Concerto, then Prokofiev 6. I mean, there aren't many conductors who would dare do that, let alone pull it off with such panache. And the orchestra they sounded fabulous. And then a few days later, I heard them under Ed Gardner, and they sounded equally wonderful, but with a very, very different kind of approach. So very flexible, very typical, I think, of a British orchestra.
Yeah, and of course, both Gardner and Jurovsky very much associated with opera. But, Vladimir Jurovsky has this... I completely agree with you. Not only an incredible imagination when it comes to programming, but this just extreme integrity. He doesn't do anything that's not done, that doesn't come from a sort of deep place within himself. And I remember when he conducted a Brahms cycle there, and it was just not what anyone either expected or wanted of him, frankly. And yet it was magnificent. Maybe magnificent is the wrong word, because it was actually extraordinarily sensitive and subtle, and kind of Brahms like I'd never really heard Brahms on record before. And I think that made it onto the orchestra's own label. From a recording perspective, it's interesting that the LPO is sort of being back on Decca a bit recently as an accompanying orchestra, and I think that's probably quite telling. And it's not chosen because of the gap in its diary or because of its fees, but probably because it's such a beautiful orchestra to be accompanied by as a concerto soloist or as a singer. Certainly the best in London, I would say. Again, a real ability to articulate. And Klaus Mekele is actually a guest there, I noticed quite often. It's the one orchestra that he seems to, in London, that he seems to have a little bit of a relationship with. So that's interesting. And of course, from the pandemic, they've initiated this relationship with Marquee TV, which actually means that I see them occasionally on television here, which is very nice. Certainly has been restless in a good way over the last 5 years, the LPO, trying to find its place and successfully, I would say. And we'll perhaps the Edward Gardner imprint is yet to be felt, but I'm sure when it is fully felt, it will be very, very interesting and distinctive, which is, I guess, the most important thing in London. So many orchestras that it's very welcome when one of them becomes distinctive and you know what to associate it with.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us from Copenhagen, offering a slightly different perspective and a much closer perspective to some of the orchestras we've talked about. Starting, obviously, as we said, with one of your own Copenhagen bands. Well, it's over to the music lovers and the general public to decide which is going to be our Orchestra of the Year this year. I have absolutely no idea how it will go, but there are some really astounding bands, and I would just encourage people to go on to whatever streaming service or buy the CDs, but listen to as much of this music as possible, because there really are some great recordings that have come out from certainly these 5 bands in the last 12 months or so. So once again, thank you very much. Music from Sir Michael Tippett's opera A Midsummer Marriage, the London Philharmonic, was conducted by its principal conductor Edward Gardner, a recording issued on the orchestra's own label and very warmly received in Gramophone's pages. Well, to vote for the 2023 Gramophone Orchestra of the Year, just head to gramophone.co.uk/awards between now and September the 7th. But maybe wait until after next week's podcast, when I'll be talking about the remaining 5 orchestras with Rob Cowan. But in the meantime, why not visit Apple Music Classical, where you can listen to 10 specially created playlists, one for each of the contending ensembles. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support, and consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.